Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. I'm Sally Whipple, the Executive Director, and I'm really pleased to have you all here today, and really pleased to be introducing this program, History for All, telling stories of everyone's past. How we understand ourselves relies very much on how we understand the people around us. It is such an important part of understanding the world. Last week we had a teacher workshop in this room, and we had an interesting experience. What we did with the teachers was we had them look at primary documents and images related to the Amistad captives who were actually tried in this room in 1839. And they read about their lives as they were told to interpreters in the 19th century, and they read about where they came from, who they lived with in their homes in Africa, what they did for a living, how they were captured. And they really got to know each captive in a personal way. And as we had the group discussion at the end of the exercise, one teacher said something along the lines of, I always thought of them as a collective, as a group of people. And I can't believe I never before thought about who they left behind and what their lives were like, and how horrible it must have been on the most basic level to be wrenched away from home, not knowing if you'd ever get back, not thinking that you'd ever get back, and knowing that this person left behind a brother and a sister and a mother that he lived with. This person left behind 2 children. This person left behind a wife and a child. Getting to know those people personally really, I think, stunned this woman. And I think it stunned a lot of us as we really started to peel away these very basic stories of lives. And I'm hoping that today's, I'm sure that today's program will help us do that, will help us think about how we look at everyone around us and think of ourselves and think about how we can understand other people's stories. Museums are always about helping to tell other people's stories, and we haven't always done a great job. But I think we're starting to wake up, and I think you're going to see evidence of that today. To get us started this morning, I would like to introduce our host, Diane Smith, who is the Senior Producer for Program Development for the Connecticut Network. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for coming out on this warm, humid summer day. Although we promised we weren't going to complain about the weather this summer, right, after last winter, right? Okay. I'm trying to keep that promise. As Sally was saying, museums and cultural institutions are often our gateways to our past. But as they reveal our history, are they leaving out important groups, important peoples? How do we present the complete picture of Connecticut's past, and how does our understanding of history affect our view of the present and our view of the future? And are museums too concerned with collecting stuff rather than collecting stories? These are just a few of the questions we're going to address today. Our guest speaker is Laurie Lamarre. She is the Executive Director at the Institute for American Indian Studies, a museum and research center in Washington, Connecticut. She's inspired by how museums of all shapes and sizes open pathways between cultures, how the perspectives, stories, and understandings of past places and peoples can shape our future. Laurie has a BA in History and Anthropology from UConn and an MA in Museum Education and Museum Studies from Tufts University. She's worked with various museums and historical societies around southern New England, including the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. Please welcome Laurie Lamarre.
So thank you, Diane, and thank you, Sally, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Frank and Jody and Ruth, who are also our panelists here. I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say, and to the Old State House for hosting this. So I wanted to start out a little bit about talking about what the goal is for today. And I'm going to give you a little bit of museum social anthropology past and how museums have, if not by accident or on purpose, established a narrative that's not necessarily representative of America's narrative. And I can't take any claim for this quote or really anything that is going to be in this presentation, but it's more of a collective memory of museums past and how Native people have felt about museums' interpretations of them. So it's really not necessarily my words, but words from many other people. But I think this quote actually comes out of Gail Anderson's Reinventing the Museum book. And I'd love for all of us to keep this in mind as this discussion over the next hour, this conversation happens, that within all cultures, varied versions of the past and the present exist at the same time. There are different perspectives, there are different voices, and that what is my truth, what is your truth, are very different things. And a little bit is that because no one speaks the same, no one experiences the same thing just the same, or even thinks in the same way. So your truth is not necessarily my truth. And in terms of our questions today, how have museums and interpreters shaped our past? And how is that relationship representative of how museums represent Native American peoples? My background, I am not Native American, but I've worked with the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center and the tribe and individuals for about 15 years. And watching how our research and work has represented the tribe and their ethno-historical background and their collective background really gave insight and empathy into perspective for me. And I hope we can bring a little bit of that today and why museums have touched on this in probably many inappropriate ways over the past. And for our panelists, how can museums take a more expansive look at Connecticut history and cultures? So I'm a firm believer in knowing where you're going is really hard when you don't know where you've come from. So as any millennial, I Google imaged what a history museum looks like. And this is what it came up with. And Google's perception of what a history museum is, to me, looks very stark. It looks very cold. It looks uninviting, towering, palace-like, artifacts behind cases, untouchable, unconnectable, very unempathetic. And in my mind, to the everyday visitor, to the 7-year-old child, to the grandmother, does this really represent our communities? These museums, to me, appear unreachable and inaccessible and very unconnectable. So what are museums? And what do they stand for? A recent article by John Balk that ran in the History News Network and actually on Time talked about museums and how they function as historians, that they are, quote, America's attic, and that they've long occupied a very privileged yet marginal space in American culture, somewhere between elite bastions of high culture and unconnected places. They function as interpreters of Americana. However, they produce predictable highlights of the American past, affirmations of an American narrative of founding, growth, and dominance, filtered through the lenses of your local town, your state, your history, your region, of a particular subject from a particular time. And that museums often fade and actually feed into misrepresentations. They perpetuate myths and ethics from the 19th century. They've created a sense of distrust with communities that they aren't accurately representing, especially considering their association with authority and privilege. So this perpetuation of this 19th century American social construct, that these stereotypes of race and ethnicity, and from our perspective at the Institute for American Indian Studies, of what we try to combat every day, this myth of the disappearing Indian, that the need to search and find and save what these 19th century museologists actually thought was a disappearing culture, something of the past. And the question of what is and what is worthy of a museum collection is part of that history. What is worthy of being in a museum? Is it really just the stuff? You know, were we so focused on the stuff, those projectile point collections, those arrowheads, that ethnographic representations actually created a sense of distrust and misrepresented from Native peoples to museums. And this relationship, why would a Native person visit a museum if they feel so unconnected, misrepresented? How can they identify with our social studies curriculum, or actually even support this type of curriculum? And also in popular culture with representation of Native peoples and mascots that is so misappropriated and incorrect that it really does an injustice to culture. These things or spoken about and time again by W. Richard West, who was the founding director of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. And he gives the history of the Smithsonian of the Native American collections there, which were collected by a man named George Gustav Hay, the Hay Foundation, of the Museum of the National Indian in New York City. And the 800,000 objects that Hay collected over a series of numerous years is an impressive collection. It's a great assemblage. It's the materials, the objects, the artifacts, the artwork is amazing. But who made it? No one knows. Hay was a man of the times, the 19th century collector, and viewed the American Indian history as something, quote unquote, as disappearing. That Native peoples and communities, and this is quoting West, were off the stage of history. This was a cultural salvage operation to collect the remnants of a dying people. And this couldn't be more than wrong. This quote-unquote rescue of a disappearing culture also took place in Connecticut. Early anthropologist Frank Speck, even actually Ezra Stiles, our founder of Yale, and early archaeologists Norris Bull, Edward Rogers, and Charles Moorhead of the Peabody Andover. These collections exist in our state. The Norris Bull collection is at our Connecticut State Museum of Natural History at UConn. The Institute for American Indian Studies holds in our collection the Edward Rogers work, as well as Ezra Stiles at Yale and Charles Moorhead at the Peabody Andover in Massachusetts. These are things that they're objects. They haven't really necessarily been associated with individuals. And these stories are missing. Museums were viewed as Native Americans, and this is quoting West again, as the final ugly and unadorned edge of manifest destiny. That this is something further pushes abject warfare, the federal policies of deculturalization, dispossession. This was the ultimate act of colonialism and actually picked up cultural residual of what they were. Now, I wanted to bring this to contemporary times, and I wanted to share with you my new favorite book, which is an anthology of New England Native writings, and it's called Dawnland Voices. And Siobhan Senior, our editor here, writes in her introduction that avid readers have at least heard that Native American literature exists, but some believe it was all oral traditions. If they've read any Native authors at all, these are almost always from the Southwest or Great Plains. On shelves labeled, quote, American Indian, in your local bookstores, writers from New England are almost always neglected. That neglect, I soon learned, has deep historic and political roots and does damaging work to the indigenous people who still live here. So, how can museums bridge the gap? How can we work with non-white populations rather than working for them? Our understanding of history versus heritage, of identity and values is up for discussion. What is history? How is it transmitted? How is it written? How is it shared? And by whose voices? It is the Native perspective that a collective memory is based more on notions of place, of homeland, not of dates, facts, or times. But who and what gets to decide authenticity and authentic? And with that, I will read from my new favorite book of Dawnland Voices, the words of a man named Bruce Curless, tribal leader at Nipmuc and Nipmuc Man. And he speaks about authenticity. It's called Authentic Power and Stuck in My Craw. Strange how one can wake in the morning and think the day is normal, or as close to it as any morning could possibly be, when all of a sudden, bam, reflection hits and thoughts are diverted and shifted, twisted, and focused on an idea. Let's take today, for instance. I was waking as I usually do and grateful to be waking up, which meant I was alive, one of the things I'm usually grateful for. But right before I got up and out of bed, the thoughts of the word authentic hit. Maybe it was inspiration or just recent conversations. Maybe it was my deep-seated disdain for the word. Actually, I don't have a problem with the word authentic. I would suppose it's about the use and the situations I have found myself in when it has been used. Like most words, authentic has its origins, uses, and definitions. Yet when I look it up in the dictionary, the multiplicity of defining properties of the word itself, only one stands out, and here it is: true to one's own personality, spirit, or character. I think of authentic as a word meaning original, factual, real, being a meaning that is mostly used when talking of objects, such as art or other inanimate things. However, my disdain for authentic occurs when people use it as a tool of power over another group, person, or animate object. So this is what got stuck in my craw this morning. And as a way to understand why it causes me such annoyance, here I am writing about it. A little about me might help. I'm a Nipmuc Indian from Massachusetts. I served as a commissioner and the chair of the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs. I've worked for national nonprofits and tribal communities all over the country. And one might ask, at least I would, how and why does a single word create such bedevilment? For me, it's not just one word, as I mentioned above, it's about power. You could replace authentic with a multitude of other words that have been used to devalue, humiliate, and degrade people, communities, and livelihoods, and even to conquer or extinguish cultures. I can think of a host of examples when the term authentic has been used as a term of power. And a few of these examples talk about how he didn't recognize the challenge or the idea that whose material might be recognized as authentic over someone else's. He prefers going to the source, the tribes themselves, as possible, rather than a published scholar. In other situations, he was asked for some very specific information for publication. The information was tribally specific and came from the tribe itself. Once again, I was taken aback when my supervisor questioned the authenticity and even the source, and went on to give examples of non-Indian scholars who had contradictions to the information that was presented. Another example of one I run into far too often. I've had the opportunity to MC many powwows over the years. I use the term, quote, Indian when describing dances, singing groups, and the people. Inevitably, someone or several someones will tell me that the term Indian is incorrect and that I should use the term Native American. I will spare the expletives that I want to use in response, because I'm a professional after all. And what I usually try to say is, I use the term Indian, and although that isn't what you may understand, it is how and what I know and how I identify the people whom I'm speaking of and how I identify myself. If a supplemental explanation is needed, I expound Native, by my understanding, is that if you were born there, you are a native of that place. So those born in America are native of America, and therefore Native American. For me, that just doesn't cut it. I may have been born here, but it's much deeper than that. Indian doesn't quite cut it either, but that's how I identify. It is just absurd that someone would question how one identifies, yet someone has embedded the term Native American in the American psyche, that it's the right and authentic term to describe the authentic First Americans, hence removing power from one group and giving the power over it in the most basic form of identification. Looking back over these thoughts, I can't help but wonder if there truly is an authentic Indian experience. I find myself laughing inside because authentic isn't stuck in my craw any longer. I have removed the proverbial thorn from this lion's paw. But what I do know is that authentic is just a word, like so many others, that I choose not to pay attention to because I understand its meaning and its use. For some, it's to gain understanding, and for some, a tool to challenge. And mostly, it's a word used to exercise power and ego, a moving target based on the needs of the people wanting the truth to match their understanding of the truth. For my authentic self, the definition is simple: being true to one's own personality, spirit, or character. How about you? So, with that, I'd like to thank Bruce Curless for writing this piece, but to talk a little about the importance of preservation history and culture in teaching. That humanities and history help people's craft solutions, open their minds to possibilities. It's fundamentals to civil society. It encourages tolerance, empathy, an informed public, and a thriving, engaged democracy. The pictures that you see on the screen are, if you know me, you know I'm big on empathy. But they are experiences that I've had lucky to be a part of. One was a Native mascot conversation panel that was held at the Noah Webster House with Christopher Newell, Passamaquoddy, who spoke about his experience of being at Dartmouth College and how his perspective of the Native mascot at Dartmouth College affected his life. The other is actually an archaeological project which was run by the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. And we, at that time, were excavating at Native colonial battlefields that took place during the Pequot Wars, 1636 and 1637. Watching these programs and experiences were one of those things that brought off authenticity, imagination, compelling pieces that were so very important to museums and how they work with communities and invoke sympathy and empathy. So in opening these pathways with communities, I always go the who, what, when, where, why, and how. You know, who do we want to open up conversations and pathways with? Communities, the people of Connecticut. And what do we want to do? We want to incorporate these stories and where into our history museums. And why? This is actually a Dan Spock quote, because it's the right thing to do. It's pretty simple. We really want to move this and push this conversation farther. And how, in order to do that, I'm going to leave to our panelists because I think they're going to be better at it than I am. But I would also suggest that the invocation of voices and originality and compelling pieces from those people and from these communities are the biggest thing. And that conversation about authenticity and allowing this information to kind of sink in, to say that museums are not the authority. The communities who are telling these stories and sharing this information is. And so I bring up these questions of what tools or points can we as museums offer to support communities in their own history, their art, their culture, and how can we entice and engage communities who typically do history on their own? Is it a collective memory? Is it written? How can we do that? And how can we as museums use our expertise to move forward? And what are the opportunities? As well as how do we make this accessible for communities who are practicing these pieces, their culture, in ways that are non-traditional museum outlets, via social media, the online, in their, in, I don't even know, all sorts of different places. But in those questions and in those answers, just to remember that these varied versions of the past and the present exist at the same time. Thank you.
That's a lot of questions, Laurie. I should ask you to be the moderator so you can ask some of those. So let me introduce our panel to you today. On this, my far right, is Jody Blankenship. Jody is the Executive Director of the Connecticut Historical Society. The Society's mission is to inspire and foster a lifelong interest in history through exhibitions, programs, and Connecticut-related collections. Prior to his appointment at CHS, Mr. Blankenship served as the Kentucky Historical Society's Education Director. In the center is a guest we've had a number of times and always enjoy having, Frank Mitchell. He is the Curator and Assistant Director of the Amistad Center for Art and Culture. His Amistad Center exhibitions include Emancipation, War Prizes, The Cultural Legacy of Slavery and the Civil War, and Lincoln, Man, Myth, and Memory. Frank is a co-author and photo editor for the 2014 Wesleyan University Press anthology, African American Connecticut Explored, which is a wonderful book, and I believe we have it in the bookshop here if anyone is interested. Very, very interesting book. And finally, Ruth Garby Torres is a co-founder of the Schaghticoke Women's Traditional Council. Besides being a Schaghticoke woman, she was a state trooper for 21 years. Thank you for your service. And is now a consultant to Harvard's course, Nation Building, American Indians in the 21st Century. She is also a tribal consultant to the Yale Indian Papers Project and the chair of the Connecticut Native American Heritage Advisory Committee. And Ruth also recently joined the Board of Trustees at the Institute for American Indian Studies, Laurie's institution. So thank you all for being here. A question I'm going to open up to all three of you. And Ruth, I'll start with you. let's start with the premise that museums, cultural institutions, and schools need to consult with diverse groups. Let's just make that our truth for today in order to interpret Connecticut history. When should museums and other institutions reach out, and how?
Well, that's a two-way street too, Diane. There are times when people in the community recognize, either through research or a visit to an institution, that there's something wrong. And so there are acts that individuals can take to point that out to the institution that, you know, this isn't exactly right, you can do that a little better, and I'm here to help. The other way that the institution can do it is becoming familiar with the people in the communities who may be that subject area expert, or may be, as Laurie said, who may themselves be the pathway to somebody else in the community who is an expert on those things. And so it's an outreach effort. Not long ago, there was a project, and I'm going to forget the name of it, but I was always doing research here at the State Library. I stumbled across it because of something I was trying to learn, and I was disappointed at the information that they had about American Indians, later on learning that this whole thing was being redone. So the people that were the consultants on that project, through our outreach individually, realized we should have started this consultation process a long time ago. And so it's from the beginning, a new exhibit,
And I like that idea that it's a two-way conversation, a two-way street. Frank, what's your opinion on this?
I think they're not mutually exclusive, and the pathways can be simultaneous. So the Mayan Museum at a certain point started doing oral histories within Black Waterbury, and did an amazing job of establishing trust with the community there, with community leaders, with tracking down stories from elders and then the next generation. And from that, people got engaged in a project around one of the earliest Black residents in Waterbury, the enslaved skeleton Fortune, who's now been buried. But the process of getting to know people who were community leaders and telling those stories led to this really fascinating partnership with the community around telling Fortune's story.
Jody, it occurs to me that the exhibit that you have at the Historical Society right now really speaks to this whole question.
Yes, so the current exhibit is Connecticut 50 Objects and 50 Stories, and we began that exhibit...
Which, by the way, you can see online if you haven't had a chance to get to the Historical Society.
Absolutely, at chs.org.
Yep.
We began that exhibit actually about 4 or 5 months before the physical exhibition was installed, and what we did is we reached out to the communities we cast as wide a net as possible, and we asked people to submit a photo of an object that represents a story that they think or feel defines Connecticut for them. And so we collected those through an online submission and a gallery where you can go and see them all today, as you said. And it was really interesting to see the diversity of objects and stories. And it speaks directly to Laurie's quote about, well, as you can see up there, that within all cultures there are varied versions of the past and present. And we saw everything from marriage certificates to sermons to spacesuits to you name it.
And it really was a wonderful exhibit, in part because it's not the narrative that we always hear. As part of this exhibit, there is a large wall with a big piece of paper on it so visitors can write on their ideas of objects that they would have included or topics they would have included. And I thought that so many of those were interesting, yet there were a lot that we always pull up again and again. And I don't mean to disparage these parts of our culture, but Mark Twain, Samuel Colt, you know, the over and over and over stories that we've heard, and the things that are represented in your exhibit are so much different.
Well, one of the things that we tried to do is get people to think a little bit, because there aren't 50 stories that can define Connecticut. That's impossible. So we chose 51 because we thought we could fit 50 in the galleries. So there's a practical concern. But then, too, we tried to choose things that would get people to think about opposing ideas. How can these two things exist in the same culture? And what does that mean for us? And then have discussions about those things. So we hoped that people would bring a different perspective, both on the objects that were in the exhibition, but also tell us what things we were missing or what was absent.
Really works, I think. Frank, I want to ask you a question that's based on a thought I had with my conversation with Ruth. She mentioned to me, she said, this is not about being politically correct. This is about being correct in telling the story. And I thought about the creation of the Amistad Center. Is that an effort to create the history that we know of in Connecticut, or at least to give us a broader view?
Certainly a broader view, and I like the opening pathways metaphor, that it was an opportunity to add nuance to what was happening within the Wadsworth, to sort of create a space for a different story, and we see that as part of our mission today, to sort of have a context in which people can see the collections that have been collected, but also see them in dialogue with another way of telling the story.
And what you mentioned is interesting, that it is within the Wadsworth, so that one doesn't have to, travel to another location, but you see it within the context of what we've already thought of as our history, which is really interesting. Ruth, I want to talk about Native Americans and their representation in American history. I read a really interesting article by an author named Angela Wilson, and she commented this way. She said, historians mistrust the ability of Native people to keep accurate accounts of their historical past, while Native Americans mistrust the ability of historians to accurately interpret Native American historical realities. What's your comment on that?
First, wow.
She kind of summed it all up there, didn't she?
Yeah, I know she did. And to me, she's really stating the obvious, right? That's exactly what happens. Because Native people, I would say, and I certainly cannot speak for all Native people. I mean, that's sometimes also the mistake that folks make,
right,
is thinking that here I am, Ruth Torres today, speaking for all, Native Americans, or indigenous peoples even in the world. I'm not. And so I would say that, that I would also, I'm, as I was introduced, a state trooper, right? That wasn't by accident. I'm a very curious person. I like to look for the truth through investigations, and so I'm a really dogged researcher. And so even I do, when somebody gives me an example of something that's based on oral history, for instance, I have a lot of questions. And because of my own background, growing up and being schooled in public schools, I also gave more weight to, well, it's written here, so this has more truth to it. Or it's on the internet, right? It must be true.
That's really the worst, isn't it?
So that is, I think, just stating the obvious, that, that we are both distrustful. And I think that we just have to have a dialogue in order to overcome some of that, because that becomes an obstacle for actually, listening to each other and hearing each other, if both sides have that line drawn between them.
Listening to each other and hearing each other, Frank, brings me to a conversation that you and I have had a little bit following what happened in Charleston, the terrible tragedy there with the shooting that was racially motivated by all accounts. There's been a national discussion now about heritage and legacy, that whole thing wrapped up with the Confederate flag. Would you talk to me about that a little bit?
Sure. So I guess I'd back up into the conversation of the point you make about history, fact, truth, and interpretation. And I think some of what's happening in sort of the debate over the flag in South Carolina, really, or whether it's heritage or history, is sort of people's misunderstandings or disagreement over some of those constructs, and what interpretation means, and how we understand or make sense of facts and truths and histories, and sort of share them. We have hard pieces to tell stories from in our collection. We actually have objects that go back to advertising history in the early 20th century that are racist. And the challenge isn't displaying those pieces, it really is how we interpret them, how we tell a story that is compelling and educational and sort of soothing in some ways, so that people don't come to those materials offended initially, but are willing to stop and
I've seen some of those
take them
pieces
apart.
in a couple of your shows, those overtly racist pieces of advertising, but recently I learned about another piece that I guess is not on display, but I think that is in the collection, and that's a robe of a Klansman, a KKK robe.
It's true, we do have a recent acquisition that we're sort of in process with, and it's a KK robe that was uncovered here in Connecticut in Danbury, which tells us that the Klan was active in Connecticut at various times. I guess we sort of know that. We don't always think about that. And the challenge for us, again, will be how to interpret it. It's easy to put it on view, but it's hard to be sure that every day when somebody comes into the building and sees this piece, they understand why it's there and what it means and what we're trying to tell them about it. And that's our ongoing challenge. We haven't figured it out completely yet, but we're getting there.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. I also wanted to encourage any of you, if you have comments or questions, please raise your hand, and Bill has a microphone. He'll come to you. We'd like to get you involved in the conversation, so if you could just wave frantically enough that I notice you, that would be great. And I hope I don't have my back to too many of you. Jody, talking about some of those things that Frank just mentioned, CHS recently adopted Connecticut's Folklife program. I guess it's known as CCHAP, Connecticut Cultural Heritage Arts Program. Tell us what that program's about and why CHS taking it over is significant.
Well, it's a great program. It had been formerly housed within the Institute for Community Research, another great institution. And it works with ethnic minority communities all over the state to document and to share folk traditions. And we thought it was a great fit with CHS because as we try to tell Connecticut's story, we know that there are so many stories to tell. And what I find most compelling about this state is that the larger story is about all these different people coming together and how they're shaped by their interactions with others, by the place that they're in, and how they in turn shape those things. And I think it's an ongoing story that is going to continue to have relevance for us as we move forward. And so we thought that this program was such a wonderful addition to the portfolio of programs that CHS has. And more importantly, it's our hope that we can make the CHS more like what the CHAP is doing right now.
Ruth, I'm thinking back to one of the points that Laurie made, and she said there's been this narrative, I think she might have even called it a myth, of the disappearing Indian. I'll put that in quotes, if you will. And yet, when I was at the Connecticut Historical Society, I saw a beautiful wedding gown made for a Native American bride just recently.
My cousin. Yes. You know, there's a great book that has been written by Jeannie O'Brien, who is a scholar at the University of Minnesota, called The Firsting and Lasting, basically writing American Indians out of existence in New England, so just in New England alone. This happens all the time, and one of the things that when I'm doing my own research, I really look to, but have to interpret, are old newspaper articles. And so I can't tell you how many times I find the last of the Scatacokes, the last of the Pequots, and then 100 years later, the last of the Scatacokes, the last of the Pequots, right? So, and this is, this is what people, 100 years ago, like we do today, open up our newspapers with our cup of coffee and have a certain amount of reliance that these journalists have done their homework and are speaking the truth.
And that is a really interesting point that you and I have conversed about, which is that history is not just our past. We're making history every day. And so those kinds of documents, if you will, we may not think of them when the newspaper lands on the doorstep. You may not think of it as a document of history, but in fact, it is shaping our history, or at least our vision of it.
It is. And anyone that's done any kind of research, whether it's historical or otherwise, go into the archive, what are you looking at? Whether it's on microfiche or some other kind of medium, you're looking at old records, and they are often in the times of, in the form of newspaper articles. And again, knowing what I know about some of what I've researched, I can put this in context, but what about somebody that doesn't have that much familiarity with it and then takes this as the gospel truth and then teaches that perhaps, to children even.
And I think, from my point of view as a journalist, that not only puts a heavy burden on journalists that they need to take up, but what frightens me is how many people out there consider themselves to be reporting the news, and they have no journalistic background. So even a good journalist who has some background is going to be tripped up or is going to make mistakes or is going to write a one-sided story. But people who have no idea of what the fundamentals are of journalism, but are what we call now citizen reporters or what have you, that makes me even more nervous, because then I think that goes down in the record online as something true that no one knows is true.
Correct. Yeah, it's very worrisome. Very worrisome.
Frank, how do you how do you address those kinds of things? I mean, it occurs to me that people reading the internet now are maybe coming up with even more myths and recreations about our past than were out there previously, when we were reading textbooks that now people say are so outdated.
Yeah. I mean, it's an opportunity. I think it's a chance for us to encourage teachers and students and community members to think for themselves and to think about how people learn what the Common Core is making you kind of work with in school, and sort of how you address facts and histories and interpretations as you engage them. I think it really means that as 21st century citizens, if we're literate, we should always be thinking for ourselves and challenging and sort of asking the question twice and creating spaces where that can happen.
Mm-hmm. Jody, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think this is one of the changes that you're finding in museums these days. We used to be so focused on pushing out content that we forgot to help people understand how that content is created, and that history is going to change over time as we have discussions, as we discover new information, as we have some perspective on the past, and our interpretations of that will consistently change. And I think where a lot of organizations are starting to head is really defining themselves as educational institutions that are helping people not just understand the content, but how that content is created, so that they can actually be a part of that process, that they have a say in that history. They can do research, they can interpret this for themselves, and they can have conversations with others about what is that meaning. I think if we can accomplish that, that we're going to have a much richer, deeper understanding and appreciation for history.
We have our first question right here.
Many comments from the panel have put heat on professional historians. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the relationship between the museum community and the academic historical community in the pursuit of history that's more authentic, if we use that word, or real, or more popular. And what does the museum community have to learn from professional historians, and what do professional historians have to learn from the museum community?
Oh, interesting. Who wants to take that first?
Jody.
Well, often a term we use in our field is that we are public history institutions, and I think that the niche that we occupy is taking a lot of the content that's developed by academic historians and making it maybe more, at the risk of sounding insulting, which I don't mean to be, more open to the public, more understandable, and to get the public involved in that scholarship.
And I guess I would add, I hope people don't see these paths as being kind of distinct, that they are parallel, that as we're encouraging people to think for themselves and do their own research, learn from scholars, and to learn from our collections, there is still authority that's held within the institution. We need to figure out what that looks like and where it's valid for us to talk about how these collections and why they matter, but to give space for other voices to move into that process and talk with us about how they matter kind of outside our collection storage areas.
Ruth, you said something really interesting that just, I can't stop thinking about this point that you made, which is we can't understand law or public policy without understanding history. And I want you to explain what you mean by that, particularly in terms of Native American issues.
Oh, Native American law is perhaps slightly less convoluted than tax code. So that would be, beyond my 2 seconds here. But why I said that is because all law is a reflection of history. And whether it's the law that comes out of, for instance, the civil rights movement, or women's rights, women's voting, the decisions that, for instance, come out of the U.S. Supreme Court are a reflection of the time. And whether that be 300 years ago or, last week, those decisions and the resulting policies that come from those decisions are a reflection of history. And so if you don't understand history, if you don't know what happened when women got the right to vote, for instance, you may not understand some of these cases that then ended up in some of the public policies. And so, again, with Native American law, it's just...
Well, yeah, I won't ask you to interpret Native American law.
I'm not
but
a lawyer, so...
Yeah, I will say that it struck me as very interesting that when there are contemporary issues surrounding Native Americans, and we've had one just recently in our state, that if people don't know the background on things like treaty rights and different issues of, taxation, Native American law, then they can't really understand what the context is of this.
Correct, yeah. And that really causes for some hard feelings, I think, in the community when there is this lack of understanding for the foundation that is in the law. And I don't know whose responsibility that is. I have a friend who teaches history in high school, and I've always said, you're teaching your students about the so-called 3 levels of government in Connecticut, federal, state, and local. I said, you're not teaching them about the other 4th level of government, which is tribal government. And so if students at an earlier age, and I am not a teacher, and I don't know how these things are introduced in curriculum, but if there are opportunities to talk about these things at an earlier age, and why there is, for instance, such a thing called federal acknowledgement. What are the roots of that word? I think that if there's an understanding later as adults, there is less tension, when it becomes public policy, for instance.
And it strikes me as you're saying that in some cases it might be interpreted by Native Americans as discrimination on the part of the largely white culture, when in fact it may be ignorance.
Yeah,
not understanding what Native Americans were promised
or signed treaties to. Or a combination.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I don't mean to forgive everyone on that score, but I think that some of it can be simple ignorance, not knowing what the law is. Frank, I wanted to get back a little bit to what we've been talking about since Charleston, because, of course, it sort of came up here as well, not with the Confederate flag, but we've had this discussion about Calhoun College at Yale University. We had a discussion even about changing, it looks like they will, change the name of the big fundraising dinner that the Democratic Party does in the state every year, which is known as the Jefferson Jackson Bailey Dinner, to get rid of those names, Jefferson and Jackson. Can you just erase that, and is that appropriate?
I don't think you can erase it. I think that becomes a really, really difficult thing to do. It is our history. I like the idea of teaching from it and finding ways to keep the old but add something new. So adding another name, finding some kind of programming that makes it possible for folks to remember why we recognize those historical figures and adding new ones, but sort of putting them away is impossible. They're not going to go away. It's part of our history and we can't forget it.
Does anyone have any questions or comments? Let's bring a microphone over here, Bill, and then we'll come to you next. Right here in the front.
Good afternoon. I have a question about the comment you made where historians don't trust the Native Americans and the Native Americans don't trust the historians. So how do you find that balance between interpretation so that, I don't want to say that both parties are satisfied, but that, that they understand one another?
It's a good question.
I would say that nobody is ever going to be really happy, and start at that premise that that there are some folks that are really, for a variety of reasons, dug into that this is just how it is, and there's nothing that you can do to change my mind. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Maybe their mother told them something, and if your mother told you something, that's gospel. You don't challenge it. Maybe it's what they learned in school. But if people find occasions to have this kind of dialogues and are willing to listen, again, as I mentioned, not just to hear, but to listen to each other, I think that those are opportunities that, if there are enough people in the room particularly, not just a conversation between two folks, that there's an opportunity for other people to learn from that. And what I think is a great happening that has happened is that there are more and more Native American scholars, right? So there's more Native American PhDs. There's more Native American historians. There's more Native American public policymakers, so that when those folks now have the initials to put behind their names, hopefully, if not for other reasons, they are also getting the same standing in that academic world.
Oh, we have a question right here. Yeah.
I guess my thoughts have just been expanding a little bit more on what you were saying, and that is I would like to see young children starting out really early, learning the entire picture, rather than when they do get older, as Ruth say, all of a sudden they're surprised by something that seems very alien to them, and it turns out to be a sidetrack or a museum exhibit or something that's extra and not part of the mainstream. And all the stories of all the people have to be mainstream from a very early age, so they're not surprised, and it's part of who they are. All of it is part of the thread of who we are. And Jefferson will never get rid of him. He did some other things, and we shouldn't. We really should have. And Mason, he stands there in Windsor, that big statue. There was a big hunter, and they should be there because we have to learn. And the Confederate flag, we have to talk about that too, and what all of that meant for people. So, but the more integrated it becomes when children are small and they understand that they're a part of this whole big fabric rather than be surprised later. I guess that's what my main point here, and we've all touched on that.
Thank you. We had a speaker here a few months ago, Ann Farrow, who's done quite a lot of research into the Amistad case and recently has put out a book that took her 10 years to write, in which she discovered log books from some slave ships that went from Connecticut over to Africa and brought back captives to become slaves. And she made this comment that many people see slavery as a chapter in the history of America. And she said, but I tell you, it is not a chapter, it's the book. And people were stunned. Frank, I'm sure you've heard her say that, or you've considered that. And the fact that, and the reason people were stunned was that she talked about how the earliest settlers who came to New York had slaves with them, and how many people in New York City had slaves. And, people thinking Southern, it really was kind of shocking.
Really? Yeah, and I think part of it goes back to sort of clarifying the lines. But certainly from our perspective at the Amistad Center, we certainly see slavery as the book. And we continue to interpret and tell various aspects of the story, distinguishing our role as folks who interpret, who sometimes get to create that history or research that history or sort of tell it in new ways, but mostly finding ways to interpret that Bible through our collection. And it really is our role to interpret it. And every day we do that.
And to Ruth's point about people not wanting to accept a different story, one of the discussions that we had that day in the audience was a person who kept saying, but they weren't really slaves, they were indentured servants, and so they could eventually earn their freedom, right? They really weren't slaves. They really, and was very insistent upon that, and just could not accept the fact that, no, these were slaves. These were people who were bought and sold and brought here and helped build our country. It was really, it was an interesting discussion.
And I guess a side note would be, because we're in the Wadsworth and we have the benefit of these incredible collections, a lot of them contemporary artwork by African-American artists today who continue to tell that story in new ways. And I think it's one thing to do that from historical artifacts in which people may be able to kind of argue back, but from fine art, you get another perspective, and it's much more multidisciplinary. And it's a great tool in reminding people that this is the Bible. Slavery is the Bible, and we're still working on it, hundreds of years after the fact.
Right.
And can I add just that before Connecticut, for instance, was a state, before the United States was the country, colonial New England, there were efforts to enslave Native people here. So the folks at Pequot who were the victims of the Pequot massacre, if their families died, the men were enslaved and they were brought down to Bermuda. So slavery in New England and in Connecticut didn't start with the importation, sadly, of the folks from Africa.
It starts with contact.
Right.
Did we have another question in the audience here? Right there.
My name is Lynn Williamson, and I've had the privilege of being the director of the Connecticut Cultural Heritage Arts Program that's now at CHS, and very happy to be there. And I do a great amount of work with people all over Connecticut who come from different cultures. I feel like one of the difficulties in doing that work, and it's true for me as an individual, but it's also true for organizations, is how do you talk to, how do you work with, how can you truly listen to someone who comes from a culture, has a knowledge base, a language that's so very different from yours, and crossing over the barriers. How do we do that? And just in that last example, I kept thinking, I would really love to have someone respond to that comment from the person in the audience, someone who really had been enslaved and who had that experience of whatever culture, so that the personal experience that people have can really be foregrounded in our organizations and our institutions.
Lynn, how have you dealt with that? Because I know that you deal with multiple ethnic groups and frequently new waves of immigration, bringing in new groups from other parts of the world, and new languages and new traditions.
Right. The process of doing that work is the most important thing. It's not really the outcome, although we do, for our funders and for our museums, we have to think about our outcome. Is it going to be an exhibit? Is it going to be a program? Is it going to be a workshop? So you have to think about that, of course, but it's just a process of listening. It's a process that extends over years. I've had this job, it seems hard to believe, but 22 years, and I'm still, every time I visit someone who I've known for that length of time, I learn something new. So we really have to spend time, and we don't always have that luxury because the grants don't always allow it, but it's essential. And I'll just tell a quick story about something that happened to me just last week. I work with a lot of women who have textile skills, who come from all over the world, Bosnia, Somalia, and most recently Palestine and Afghanistan, and I was thrilled to meet them, and I don't know them well. We just met, we had a formal meeting, and I was going to collect some of their work. It was last Thursday, which was the last day of Ramadan. Of course, these women are Muslim. So we're having our meeting, and things are going along really well, and all of a sudden, one of the women from Afghanistan pulls out her iPhone, and we hear the call to prayer. And, you know, I've heard that before, so I'm okay with that. I love it. I think it's beautiful. But it just occurred to me that this woman has such a great way of addressing her own culture while she's also having a meeting with a Westerner. It was prayer time, and she couldn't leave the meeting and go to a private room, which she normally would prefer to do, I think, but she could still listen to the call for prayer. She could still honor her spirituality and continue to participate in the meeting. And it's a small example, perhaps, but I thought it was great. These folks accommodate us because they're in our world and they know how to do it. That kind of wisdom, to me, that kind of negotiation and that kind of fitting in is wonderful. And maybe we can be a little bit more open to something like that. Ask those questions. How do you want to do this? What's your background? What's your wisdom? What's your way of knowing? And it would be wonderful if we could.
Thank you, Lynn. I want to close our program today, although that was a comment that could have been the close, but I want to give each of you a chance to comment on this, and that is, Lynn mentioned listening to people and hearing their stories, and it struck me that we don't do a lot of that anymore. We don't really sit down and listen to people. We don't even listen to our own families. How many people actually have a family dinner where you can actually sit down and speak, and how many families have kids going in 14 different directions and grabbing a snack on the way in? And so it struck me that it's so important to understand the stories of your own culture, even your own family, even your own background. Where does that take us? Is that something we have to do, and where does that take us? And Jody, I'll start with you.
I think of my mother, and the folks who I know in the audience have heard this story before. She's a second-generation immigrant, and her grandmother raised her and taught her all of this history through food and music and other things. And today, she never taught that to my brothers and I. She didn't feel like that was appropriate. But my brother now has 2 daughters who she spends every weekend with, teaching them all about those recipes, that music, her grandmother, and all those ways. And so when I think about that, I think that's how we're transmitting culture from one generation to the next these days. And so I think the challenge for places like CHS is, how can we help people do that if they're not doing it already? And more importantly, how do we help save that, not just for that family unit, but how can we share that more broadly within the community? Because I think there's a larger benefit for that type of thing.
Frank?
I would totally agree with what Jody's just said. I feel like we are doing that at the Amistad Center. It is a place where people come for a particular kind of cultural heritage lesson. And I guess the challenge is how to pull more stories from people so they don't feel as they have to come to us and sort of see us as the authority, but they also share, that it's dialogic. And I think our dialogue with them and with other institutions so that we're sharing that conversation in a wider and wider and wider circle.
Ruth, I'll let you have the last word.
Thanks. I'm a big fan of StoryCorps, if people are familiar with it. And I love to listen to other people's stories. One of the things that I think I get out of that is, in part, saying, I never knew that that's how people were raised, that that's what their own family history was. What they're doing is sharing their oral tradition with me through those recordings. And so I think if we are more likely to be sharing stories with each other, even with the children in your families, I think that you're teaching the children and reinforcing the idea that just because it isn't written down doesn't mean it has less value. And so I would challenge folks even to make the time. We are all busy, but there is always that time. And I had this challenge put to me recently. I was completely unprepared when my niece asked me to tell her daughter a story about my past, and I was speechless. And so I grappled with it, but it has bothered me that I didn't have something right then and there, and so that would be the challenge, to have some story that you're willing to share, and whether it's a family member or even a younger person, that you know.
Well, I guess that's the only way we're going to hear all of Connecticut stories and tell a broader history of our state and our country. Thank you all three for being with us, and I want to thank our guest speaker, Laurie Lamarre. And thank you all for attending, and this program will be available rather soon on CTN, the Connecticut Network, or on ct-n.com, and you'll be able to watch it on demand online if you like. So thanks for coming.
Thank you, Diane, and thanks to our speaker and our panelists and to all of you for being here today. I just have to say one thing based on something Lynn was saying and something that others had said. So much of it, and when we think organizationally and institutionally and culturally, so much of it is just about personal stories. And there is a short story that I love called "If I Loved You, I Would Tell You This." And it's a really interesting story by Robin Black, who, and I won't explain the story, but really what she's saying is that we hold so much back from people because we don't love them or we don't care enough to tell them the story. But when, in this story, you can see the potential of, if this woman told her story, there would be so much understanding and life would be so much better. So I would, in the spirit of Lynn, challenge you all to go out today and just talk to somebody personally about their lives, their culture, their background, and see what that brings you. Thank you for coming, and I hope we see you again at another conversation at noon.
Thanks.